I'm Ann Flamant with Ann Flamant Real Estate. Today I'm meeting Joe and Scott at Orlando Title Services.
Hi, I'm Scott Brown, majority partner of Orlando Title Services. We're a licensed title agency with 2 underwriters located in Orlando, Florida, and we've been in business for over 10 years.
And I'm Joe Leslie with Orlando Title Services. I am the managing partner.
So, Joe, why use a title company instead of an attorney or a solicitor?
Well, and there's a big misconception that you have to use an attorney here in the state of Florida to close real estate transactions. However, in the state of Florida, we have licensed title agents, which can pretty much do the same thing as attorneys do. We are bound by the same laws, governed by the same party, and that is what we focus on a daily basis. Whereas attorneys might handle different types of cases every day, title companies focus solely on title insurance. And by doing that, we can lower the cost to the clients.
So, Joe, can you explain what the role is of a title company to a buyer?
Yes, Ann. The title company, our main objective is to represent both parties equally. We have an obligation to make sure all parties are taken care of. Therefore, we do not work for the seller directly, nor do we work for the buyer. We are a liaison between the 2 parties to make sure the transaction goes smoothly and accordingly.
So, Joe, when a buyer sends over their deposit, how protected are those funds?
Well, Ann, you mentioned the best thing is we have an escrow account. And with an escrow account, every deposit is its own separate account. Each deposit is secured by the rules of the FDIC. So once we receive the buyer's funds, they are in our account and they are safe. Furthermore, they cannot be released until we have authorization from both parties on what those funds are to be used for.
Okay, great. So it's pretty secure, I'll have to say.
Definitely secure.
So, Scott, a client's deposit is actually secured by the FDIC's regulations, I'd assume. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what the FDIC is?
Yes, the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, is basically a branch of the U.S. federal government, and it's essentially assuring all deposits up to a limit with the U.S. Treasury funds so that no one's funds can be lost in an insured account.
So, Joe, what costs are involved for a buyer?
Well, and for the buyer, they're in luck because in the state of Florida, the seller typically pays for the title insurance fees. So if a buyer's paying cash, their fees will be very minimal. Now, if they are getting a loan, they will be responsible for any cost associated with that loan. And in order to get an estimate of those, I would strongly suggest to have their lender disclose to them on a closing disclosure what their fees will be.
So, Joe, can you explain to me what the expenses are for a seller?
Well, and most seller fees are dictated by the contract and the sales price in the state of Florida. Some of the most common fees for the seller would be the title insurance, title search fee, closing fee, doc stamps to the state of Florida. But as a general rule, we usually tell the seller, depending on the contract and depending on the sales price, it'll be 1.5% to 2% of that sales price.
So, Scott, how long does the process take?
Well, the process for a title insurance agency, and especially Orlando Title Services, can be very, very variable in that we work with the contract to make the closing go smoothly, but we have closed transactions as fast as 2 days, and we've closed transactions as fast as, as long as 3 weeks or a month. It depends upon what the contract calls for and also the responses for HOA estoppels and others that we need to have for the closing.
So, Joe, what information do you gather to secure all parties in a transaction?
Well, and as you know, once we receive a contract, we try to take a proactive approach towards each of the several steps involved when processing that transaction. This means we gather all the information that we need to make sure that this transaction is closed within the guidelines of the contract to protect both the buyer and the seller. Some of the information we're going to need is obvious. Obviously, we're going to need the seller's information, marital status, addresses, the same thing with the buyer. Now, we'll also run a public search of the property to make sure there's no debts, there's no liens against the property. We'll check the tax records to make sure there's no outstanding taxes. We also run an unrecorded lien search on this, and what this does is this checks to make sure there are no code enforcement liens against the property, to make sure there are no outstanding permits. Pretty much anything that can go wrong with a property, we check it to protect the interest of that buyer.
So it is fair to say that a client will have a clean title once they own the property or close on the property.
Yes, we are bound by the laws of Florida. We will not close a property until all of the matters regarding that property are taken care of. And once we close, the owners will receive a title insurance policy issued by one of the two major title insurance underwriters in the state of Florida, which is Stewart Title Guarantee or Westcor Land Title Insurance Company.
How do you contact a foreign national buyer?
Well, that's a good question because we deal with so many international clients that we utilize a great deal of technologies. Naturally, there are emails for routine communication, but we utilize cell phones. All of our clients have our cell phone numbers, and from that we may use Google connection, we may use FaceTime, we may use Skype calls, or simply international long distance. But we are available and basically communicating in as many manners as there are to make it convenient for the client.
What I have found out, Scott, is that you often communicate through a secure type of email processor or something like it. And I'm sure that there are reasons for that because we're talking about, monetary transactions often. Can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Yes, all of our emails go out through Microsoft encrypted email, which basically is required. It's a requirement within the state of Florida that we must send information out encrypted. So it will mean if you are on an email server, Hotmail, Gmail, Yahoo Mail, and those are not encrypted, that you will get a notification from us that you have a secure message from us, and it'll allow you and give you a means of logging into it so that you can see the message, but it'll stay encrypted.
And this protect the clients, obviously, and their personal information, which is probably the main goal for doing this.
That is correct.
Okay, that is great. Thank you. So, Joe, what are some of the obstacles that you have experienced with foreign national sellers going through a process like this or through a closing?
Land, the biggest challenge that we find for sellers is if they are not coming to the United States for closing, they will need to find a notary depending on what country they're in. If they're in the UK, anywhere in Europe, they can go to a notary within those countries. But some of the other countries require an actual trip to the U.S. Embassy.
So, Joe, seeing we're dealing with foreign nationals most of the time, what is FIRPTA and how does FIRPTA involve the transaction?
Well, and as you know, when a foreign investor sells a piece of property in the state of Florida or anywhere in the United States, they fall under the FIRPTA tax guidelines. And FIRPTA basically stands for the Foreign Investment Real Tax Property Act. And what this is put in place for, it's put in place to protect the buyer of that property. Now, how do we do this? When we do the closing, we hold 15% of the sales price from the seller until we communicate with the IRS.
Scott, you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, essentially, as Joe has mentioned, it's basically designed to protect the buyer to make sure there are no outstanding taxes associated with that property because the IRS will go after the buyer, the current property owner. And so as a result, by withholding that 15%, that money is held until the tax documents are filed. Now, if the seller essentially has an accountant that does their taxes every year and they're current, they can wait till the end of the year and the IRS will release the funds as appropriate. But most people want to get an expedited release. And so as a result, we have relationships with several accounting firms that will fill out the appropriate paperwork and get it submitted to get an expedited release of funds.
So, Joe, Scott, thank you so much for having me today. It was very informative. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And it was good seeing you. We look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Ann. And as
Thank you,
always,
Joe.
you know where you can reach us.